When Elijah King, a self-made billionaire, brings his mother to celebrate a merger with the prestigious Wellingtons, he expects a formal dinner, not disgrace. But as champagne flows and secrets drip, an offhand comment from a powerful matriarch turns venomous. Elijah's past, pride, and principles collide beneath the chandeliers of high society. The world erupts after Elijah cancels the $900 million deal. Critics call him arrogant, investors panic. But behind the scenes, old wounds reopen, secret recordings surface, and the Wellingtons prepare for war. As Elijah defends his name, a deeper betrayal than family threatens to destroy the very legacy he tried to protect. The dust settles, but not without scars. As Elijah rebuilds his empire and restores his mother's honor, a forgotten truth from her past rises to the surface, threatening to unravel everything. Bloodlines blur, secrets ignite, and Elijah must confront a buried betrayal that forces him to redefine what family, power, and legacy really mean. Elijah King had built his empire from nothing, forged in the silent hours of code and chaos in a Harlem apartment, where the radiators clanged like war drums and the ceiling leaked with rain and ambition. His mother Darlene had cleaned offices at night and prayed over his notebooks by day, whispering promises of a future she might never live to see. And yet here they were, now, two bodies clothed in couture, standing in the vaulted marble foyer of the Wellingtons' estate, a gilded age mansion reeking of old money and older prejudice, where Elijah was meant to sign the deal of the century. A $900 million merger between King Tech and Wellington, industries that would seal his legacy and elevate both brands to untouchable status. But beneath the surface of crisp napkins and veiled smiles, something festered, something ancient, something raw. Because as Darlene clutched her clutch tighter and shifted in the Italian leather chair beside Elijah at the long dinner table dressed in bone china and crystal, she could feel it, the silent judgment, the looks that lingered too long, the stiffness in every greeting, the way Margot Wellington, the family matriarch, had looked her up and down when she entered, eyes pausing on her church hat like it was a costume from the wrong century on. Though Elijah noticed it too, he willed himself calm, reminded himself that diplomacy was currency, that pride had to be managed like portfolio risk. But even so, his knuckles whitened slightly each time his mother was spoken over or ignored. And when Margot, dripping in pearls and contempt, finally leaned forward after a few flutes of vintage Dom Perignon and asked, with a lilt of performative curiosity, "So Darlene, what do you do when you're not accompanying Elijah?" The room went still, and Darlene, elegant in her lavender silk, answered softly, "I enjoy gardening, and I sing at my church," to which Margot replied, laughing just loudly enough, "Oh, how quaint. You know, our help sings while they polish the silver too," and the table chuckled lightly, nervously, but it was enough. Enough for Elijah's jaw to tighten, enough for his mother to gently lower her eyes, not in shame, but in strategy, as if measuring the true character of the empire her son was about to enter. And Elijah looked across at Preston Wellington, Margot's son, the current CEO and public face of Wellington Industries, who gave a helpless shrug, as if to say, "That's just my mother." But Elijah wasn't amused. He was building a dynasty, not marrying into plantation nostalgia, and though he endured the rest of the dinner with regal restraint, each forkful of roast lamb felt like ash in his mouth. And later that evening, as he escorted Darlene back to their hotel suite, he apologized not with words, but with silence, holding her hand as they walked, his mind replaying every smirk, every minor aggression, every moment she was made to feel small in a room he had bought his way into. And by morning, when the ink was meant to flow and the cameras were meant to flash, Elijah made a decision that would send shockwaves through every financial district from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. He called Preston, voice clear and cold, and said, "The deal's off. We don't do business with families that dishonor ours," and hung up before hearing the frantic rebuttals, because what Elijah understood, what the Wellingtons never did, was that respect isn't a bonus line item in a quarterly report. It's the foundation, and when that cracks, the whole empire falls. So he returned to his office, called a press conference, and within hours, King Tech's valuations soared as the world watched a black man choose legacy over leverage, dignity over dollars. And as his mother sat quietly in the front row of the announcement, tears lining her lashes but never falling, Elijah introduced her, not as a guest but as the reason he ever learned to rise. The moment Elijah King stepped away from the podium, his mother's hand still wrapped gently around his wrist like a lifeline from another era. The fallout began not with a bang, but a tremor, a flicker in the stock tickers, a flurry of red alerts in investor inboxes, then a full-scale media storm igniting across networks and feeds, each headline sharpening its teeth. Tech deal, dead over dinner drama, billion-dollar ego, Elijah King tanks historic merger, social justice or corporate suicide. And though King Tech's loyal user base and younger investors rallied on social media, hailing Elijah as a principled leader who refused to trade his dignity for dollars, the legacy markets didn't see nobility. They saw volatility, and within 24 hours, hedge fund analysts were whispering about overexposure, rivals were circling like vultures, and board members, men who had once shaken Elijah's hand with both palms and forced smiles were now requesting emergency meetings, not because they doubted his leadership, but because they feared its cost. And Elijah, ever the strategist, expected the backlash, had already prepped countermeasures. But what he hadn't predicted was the personal nature of the coming storm. The way the Wellingtons would retaliate not through lawsuits or press releases, but through narrative warfare, whisper campaigns, and surgically timed leaks designed to portray him not as a visionary, but as a volatile, angry black man too, emotional to helm a multinational empire. And it began when Margot Wellington appeared on a morning show, feigning frailty in a lavender blouse suspiciously similar to the one Darlene had worn, saying through crocodile tears that Mr. King mistook a social faux pas for racial hostility, adding that he overreacted dramatically, and while her PR team nodded in the shadows, clips of her interview were shared and reshared by right-wing pundits eager to paint Elijah as the new villain in the culture wars. But he didn't flinch, not outwardly, even when the board summoned him, even when advertisers began to quietly pull out, because he knew what they didn't. The Wellingtons had underestimated him, mistaking his silence for softness, his respect for weakness, and what they failed to realize was that Elijah hadn't just canceled the deal to protect his mother, he did it to provoke a response, to smoke out the deeper rot, and within days, his team uncovered it, starting with a security recording from that dinner night, obtained discreetly from a sympathetic Wellington staff member who had witnessed everything and uploaded the footage to a burner. Dr. Drive before quitting the estate forever there, in crystal clear audio, was Margot's quaint comment. The snickers, the eye rolls, even Preston's off-mic joke about Kintech bringing the help. And Elijah now had the proof he needed, not just for public opinion, but for leverage. And yet, before he could act, an unexpected dagger slid through the armor, a leak not from the Wellingtons, but from within Kintech itself. Internal emails suggesting Elijah had exaggerated the humiliation for strategic gain. Emails traced to none other than Byron, Reed Kintech's coup and Elijah's oldest friend, a man he had once called brother in Forbes magazine, a man his mother had fed when he had nothing. And as Elijah read the messages, phrases like he's playing the race card to sabotage the deal, and maybe he's scared to compete with old money, his chest burned not with betrayal but clarity, because now he understood. Byron hadn't just gone rogue, he'd been planted, his loyalty bought months ago by a shadow investor tied to the Wellingtons. And this betrayal wasn't just strategic, it was personal. And so Elijah confronted him not in the boardroom, but in the quiet of the office they once shared, slamming the printed emails on the same desk where their company had been born. And Byron, caught, didn't deny it. Instead, he scoffed. You let your pride ruin everything. Eli and Elijah, standing beneath the framed photo of him and his mother in that Harlem apartment, simply said, I didn't ruin anything, you just sold your soul for a seat at their table, and then fired him, on the spot, knowing it would ignite another scandal but needing to cleanse the rot, needing to protect not just the company but the ethos behind it. And as the media seized the new twist, King ousts right-hand man. Amid internal sabotage, Elijah leaned into the chaos, scheduling interviews, releasing the dinner footage, speaking with calm fire about dignity, legacy, and the invisible tax of black excellence in white spaces. And the world listened, not just the streets, but the suits. Because now the narrative had shifted again, and even institutional investors began questioning why the Wellingtons had mocked the mother of a billionaire. They needed more than he needed them. And in the shadows, Margot fumed, Preston panicked, and Byron disappeared from the news cycle, his name a cautionary tale on tech blogs, while Elijah doubled down, unveiling new King Tech initiatives in underfunded black communities, turning PR crisis into purpose. And by the end of the quarter, King Tech stock had not only stabilized, it had climbed, bolstered by new partners who saw in Elijah not just strength but sovereignty. And while his enemies licked their wounds, Darlene remained silent through it all, watching, praying, knowing that the next battle would be harder, because money can recover, but trust once broken can take a lifetime to rebuild. And as Elijah stood on the edge of his empire, he began to sense that the final war wouldn't be against the Wellingtons or the market shut, would be against something even closer, something buried in family, in history, in secrets yet to be told. Weeks had passed since Elijah King torched the Wellington merger and purged his company of betrayal, but the fire in him had not cooled, it had evolved, grown colder, sharper, more deliberate, not a flame of rage but a forge of resolve as he reshaped King Tech into more than a company, into a movement, expanding its reach beyond code and commerce into cultural infrastructure, STEM scholarships, digital equity grants, community investment funds, all anchored in the belief that legacy wasn't what you passed down but what you lifted up. And yet, even as the world applauded and new doors opened, even as interviewers called him the new vanguard of conscious capital, something inside Elijah twisted in silence. Because while the Wellingtons faded into the shadows and Byron Bede's betrayal became just another subplot in the relentless churn of tech drama, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper, older, had been unearthed at that dinner, not just a moment of disrespect, but a truth buried long before King Tecker headlines. A shadow that began to creep when his mother, Darlene, one evening in their quiet suite, touched the necklace she always wore, a locket she'd never opened in front of him, and said, almost absently, "That woman. She reminded me of someone." And when Elijah asked who, she only said, "No one important," but her voice cracked on the last word. And for the first time since he was a child, Elijah felt like he was missing something enormous, something sacred. So he did what any son raised on secrets does. He searched, quietly, respectfully, and as his team traced Margot Wellington's lineage, names, estates, trust funds, boarding schools, marriage records, one document, brittle and yellowed, buried in a dusty archive in Charleston, cracked open the past like a tomb, a household registry from 1942 listing Margot's grandmother, Elizabeth Wellington, as the matron of a plantation-style estate, and further down the page, in cramped, slanted handwriting, the name Darlene King, housemaid, 1943 to 1945, age 14, and Elijah's breath caught, stomach hollowing, because that name wasn't his mother's, not her age, not her time, and yet when he confronted her gently, placing the document in her lap beneath the soft light of the office where he'd first taught himself to crochet, looked not surprised, but tired. So tired. The kind of exhaustion that generations pass down like hand-me-down trauma. And she closed her eyes and said, "Your grandmother, that was your grandmother?" And the locket, the one she'd clutched every Sunday in church, finally opened, revealing a faded photograph of a young black girl no older than 13, standing beside a white infant in lace. And it was then that Darlene, voice barely above a whisper, told Elijah the truth, that his grandmother, the original Darlene King, had been a maid in the Wellington household, had raised Margot Wellington's mother alongside her own children, had been assaulted by one of the men of the house, no record of which man, no justice ever saw. And that child, the child born from violence, was Darlene's mother, Elijah's grandmother, making him, Elijah King, a descendant not just of resilience, but of the very family that tried to humiliate his mother, a bloodline intertwined by tragedy, by silence, by injustice never rectified. And for hours, Elijah sat stunned, unraveling decades of identity. The pride he'd built on struggle, the power he'd claimed in defiance, now tangled in a cruel irony that his empire was built not beside white power but from within it. And yet it wasn't shame he felt, nor confusion, it was clarity, a brutal clarity, that the pain his mother endured at that dinner table wasn't just an insult, it was an echo of a crime still unspoken. And he realized then that his true reckoning wasn't with the Wellingtons, not even with Byron, but with the idea of legacy itself. Because if legacy meant inheritance, what did it mean to inherit trauma, to inherit silence, to inherit the blood of the oppressor and the oppressed? And so Elijah did what only a man forged in both histories could do. He reclaimed the narrative, not through revenge, but through revelation. Calling a press conference, not to retaliate but to reveal. Standing with his mother beside him as he told the world not just about the dinner, not just about the sabotage, but about the truth of who he was, of what families like the Wellingtons had taken and buried and renamed. And when reporters asked if he intended to sue, to seek restitution, he said, "No, that's their history. I'm building mine." And he launched the Legacy Project, a digital archive and restoration initiative that unearthed the names, stories, and dignity of thousands of forgotten black women like his grandmother, women whose lives had been erased by domestic servitude and generational abuse. And within months, the project became a global movement, with schools incorporating it into history, curricula, and descendants reuniting through DNA. And King Tech, now more mission than company, became untouchable not because it was rich, but because it was righteous. And yet in the quiet moments, Elijah still sat with the truth, stared at the faces in that locket, wondering if justice could ever be enough, if healing had a final chapter. But when his mother, now always at his side in boardrooms and summits, stood before a crowd in Harlem and sang the same hymn she once sang while cleaning floors, her voice cracked but powerful, he knew that this was the final act. Not revenge, not exposure, but reclamation. And as the crowd rose and wept, Elijah King didn't just see his mother, he saw every woman who had ever been told to smile while breaking, every boy who had ever built his kingdom from rubble, and every legacy rewritten not by blood, but by truth.